I came home at 6:40 p.m. after another 11-hour shift at the distribution hub in Cedar Grove, Illinois. And the moment I shut off the engine, I just sat there in the driveway staring at the darkened windows of our townhouse, trying to gather enough strength to walk inside. My back ached from hauling freight, and my hands were raw from cardboard and cold air. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the constant pressure in my head that had been building for days. For 9 straight days, my wife, Laura Mitchell, had found something new to be upset about, something so small and ordinary that I couldn't even process how it had turned into a full-blown argument. One day, it was the laundry, the fact that I forgot to switch it from the washer to the dryer before I left for work at 5 in the morning. Another day, it was the almond milk. Apparently, I bought the wrong brand, even though it was unsweetened like she always asked. She said I didn't pay attention, that I didn't listen, that I didn't care enough to get even simple things right. 3 months earlier, she had quit her marketing assistant job, saying the environment was toxic, and that she needed time to figure out what she really wanted. I supported her without hesitation because I loved her and because I believed in being a team. Since then, I had picked up every extra shift they would give me, sometimes working 6 days in a row, sometimes staying late to help unload trailers, so I could squeeze in overtime. In 8 days, I logged 72 hours just to make sure rent, utilities, car insurance, and groceries were covered. Every time I transferred money into our joint account, I felt a small sense of relief, like I was holding everything together by sheer force of will. But none of that seemed to matter to her lately. Instead of acknowledging the effort, she accused me of not being romantic anymore, of not prioritizing her emotionally. She said I never planned dates, that I never surprised her with flowers, that I was distant. I tried explaining that after 11 hours of lifting boxes and managing inventory, sometimes all I wanted was a shower and 10 minutes of silence, but she interpreted my exhaustion as indifference. When I told her I was doing this for us, for stability while she figured out her next move, she rolled her eyes and said I was throwing money in her face like it was some kind of trophy. As I finally stepped inside that evening, the house smelled faintly of one of those vanilla candles she liked, and I could hear the television playing in the living room. She was curled up on the couch with her laptop open, barely glancing at me when I walked in. I set my boots by the door and felt that familiar knot tightening in my chest, bracing for whatever the issue of the night would be. I hadn't even taken off my jacket before she sighed loudly and said we needed to talk about how disconnected she felt. I stood there, sweat drying on my skin, dirt under my nails, mentally calculating how many more hours I would need to work next week to cover the rising electric bill, and all I could think was that no matter how hard I pushed myself, it was never enough to satisfy her. The arguments did not just continue. They intensified with kind of steady, deliberate cruelty that made each day feel heavier than the last, and I began to measure time not by shifts at work, but by whatever humiliation or accusation was waiting for me after I clocked out. One afternoon, after I'd already worked 10 hours and stopped by the supermarket on the way home because she texted me a list of things we needed, she exploded in the parking lot over paper towels, of all things, because I grabbed a different brand than the one she preferred. Even though they were on sale and practically identical, and she stood there beside the trunk of the car, her voice sharp and echoing between vehicles, telling me I never listen and that I am careless even with basic instructions, while strangers slowed their carts and pretended not to stare. I remember feeling my face burn with embarrassment, not because of the brand of paper towels, but because of the way she looked at me like I was incompetent, like I was an inconvenience she had to tolerate. It did not stop there, and it did not stay private. At her friend Brittany's brunch, where I had already fell out of place among conversations about weekend getaways and curated social media lives, she made a joke about how boring I was, how my idea of excitement was reorganizing a toolbox, and everyone laughed in that polite but uncomfortable way people do when they are unsure whether something is funny or cruel. I tried to smile and shrug it off, telling myself she did not mean it the way it sounded, but I could feel the weight of her words settling on me like something permanent. Later that same week at my cousin's engagement party, surrounded by family who had known me my entire life, she complained that I lacked ambition, that I was content to just move boxes forever, even though she knew I had taken every extra shift possible to keep us financially stable after she left her job. I stood there holding a plastic cup of punch, listening to her talk about me as if I were not present, as if my efforts were invisible and my sacrifices insignificant. I stayed quiet through all of it because I believed that marriage required endurance, that love meant absorbing discomfort without retaliation, that if I simply worked harder, stayed calmer, and avoided escalating the conflict, eventually the tension would dissolve on its own. I convinced myself that her frustration must be temporary, that she was stressed about her career, that once she found direction again, she would soften. I swallowed my pride in public and in private. choosing silence over confrontation, because I fear that pushing back would only create more chaos. Each time she criticized me, I told myself to focus on stability, on paying the bills, on maintaining some kind of peace. But instead of calming down, she seemed to grow more hostile, as though my restraint only encouraged her to press further. Small comments turned into sharp digs, and sharp digs turned into outright contempt. She began speaking about shared decisions as if they were solely hers, rearranging furniture without asking, inviting people over without telling me, making plans that assumed my compliance without my input. I started noticing how often I hesitated before walking into a room, bracing myself for another complaint, another reminder that I was failing her in ways I could not fully understand. The apartment no longer felt like a shared space, but like a place where I was tolerated on conditioned performance. And even though I was the one covering the rent and utilities, I began to feel like a tenant occupying a corner of someone else's life, careful not to overstep, careful not to provoke, shrinking myself to avoid triggering the next explosion. That Tuesday night, the air in the apartment felt unusually still, like the kind of silence that settles before a storm. And when she told me she wanted to talk, I could already sense that this was not going to be another argument about groceries or ambition or my supposed lack of romance. She was pacing in the living room, arms folded tightly across her chest, then unfolding them to gesture sharply as she spoke. Her movements rehearsed, almost theatrical. The television was off, the lights were bright, and she positioned herself near the center of the room as if she needed the space to deliver something important. She started with the familiar accusations, saying I was emotionally unavailable, that I shut down whenever things got difficult, that she felt alone even when I was physically present. I stood near the kitchen counter listening, still in my work clothes, my shoulders aching from the day, but there was something different about the way she spoke, something calculated in her tone. She said she had tried, that she had been patient, that she needed more from a partner than financial support and silence. Her voice rose and fell in waves, as if she was building toward a climax she had already decided upon. Then she stopped pacing and looked directly at me, her eyes sharp and searching, and she dropped it like a bomb. She said she had been seeing someone else. She did not whisper it or hesitate. She delivered it cleanly, watching my face with intense focus, clearly anticipating explosion, tears, pleading, or some desperate attempt to reclaim her. I could see the expectation in her expression, the slight lift of her chin, the way her posture straightened as if she were bracing for impact. Instead, something inside me went completely still. There was no surge of anger, no panic, no heartbreak crashing over me the way I would have imagined in any other context. What I felt was calm, an almost unnerving, crystal clear calm that cut through weeks of confusion and tension. In that instant, every argument, every insult in the parking lot, every public humiliation, every accusation of not being enough snapped into place like pieces of a puzzle finally forming a picture. The hostility, the contempt, the constant dissatisfaction suddenly made sense in a way that was almost clinical. I realized that I had been fighting to preserve something that had already been abandoned. I remember taking a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle without crushing me, and I stood up in the chair I had been leaning against. I looked at her, really looked at her, and said that clarified everything. My voice did not shake, and I did not raise it. I did not accuse her back, or ask for details, or demand explanations. I simply stated that it clarified everything, because it did. The shift in her expression was immediate and undeniable. The confidence that had been radiating from her cracked almost visibly, like a thin layer of glass under pressure. She blinked, her mouth tightening, as if my lack of reaction had disrupted whatever script she had prepared. The dramatic confrontation she had likely envisioned dissolved into something far less satisfying for her, and for the first time in weeks I felt grounded, steady, and entirely certain about where I stood. I did not argue, and I did not raise my voice. I simply walked past her into the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled down the two large suitcases we usually only use for holidays, the heavy navy one with the crack handle and the black hardshell one we bought the year we moved in. The sound of the zipper scraping across the fabric felt strangely loud in the quiet apartment, and I could sense her standing in the hallway watching me, as if she expected me to stop at any second and demand answers. Instead, I knelt by the dresser and began folding her clothes with mechanical precision, lifting blouses from hangers, stacking jeans, gathering shoes from the bottom of the closet, and placing them carefully along the sides of the suitcase so they would fit. My hands moved steadily, not rushed, not trembling, just deliberate. She followed me into the bedroom and kept talking, her voice sharper now, asking if I wanted to know who it was, repeating the question like it was bait she was dangling in front of me. I told her it did not matter. I did not look up when I said it, because I truly meant it. The identity of the other man was irrelevant compared to the fact that she had chosen to betray the marriage and then announce it as a weapon. She pressed again, saying I should at least care enough to ask, that any husband would want to know. I closed the second suitcase and stood up, meeting her eyes calmly, and repeated that it did not matter. Then she shifted tactics and said she only said it to get my attention, that she was frustrated and needed a reaction, that she wanted to see if I would finally fight for her. I reminded her quietly that those were her words, that she had said she was seeing someone else, not that she was thinking about it or exaggerating, but that she had been actively seeing someone. I told her I was not responsible for the consequences of statements she chose to make in order to provoke me. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, but my thoughts remained clear. I walked back into the living room and leaned against the table, explaining in a measured tone that the lease was in my name alone, that I had signed it, that for the past 7 months I had paid the full $1,850 rent without a single contribution from her after she quit her job. I reminded her that I had covered utilities, groceries, and car payments while she figured out her next step, and I had done it without resentment because I believed we were building something together. If she was seeing someone else, then she was free to go be with him, free to build whatever she believed she had found somewhere else. I was not going to finance a household where I was being disrespected and replaced at the same time. At first she stared at me as if I were speaking a language she did not understand, and then I saw it happen, the realization settling in that I was not bluffing, that I was not posturing for effect, that I was not going to beg or negotiate. Her breathing changed, quicker and uneven, and she started pacing again, but this time the confidence was gone. She said I was overreacting, that we could talk this through, that throwing her out was extreme. I corrected her calmly and said I was not throwing her out. I was simply accepting what she had told me and responding accordingly. The panic in her eyes grew more visible with every minute that passed, because she could see that the same endurance she had mistaken for weakness had finally transformed into finality. Marcus Hale showed up just after 9, headlights cutting across the front windows before I even heard the knock, and for a second I considered ignoring it because the last thing I wanted was an audience for what was unfolding. But he had texted earlier about picking up the tools he had lent me for a shelving project, and I had told him to swing by. When I opened the door, he took one look at the 2 suitcases sitting upright on the porch beside the railing, and then glanced past me into the living room, where Lauren stood stiff and pale, and I saw the moment he understood without needing a single explanation. Marcus had known me since high school, knew the difference between a temporary argument and something final, and the expression on his face shifted from confusion to quiet certainty in less than a second. He stepped inside slowly, setting his jaw, and asked in a low voice what was going on, but it was not really a question because he was already piecing it together. Before I could answer, Lauren started talking, trying to frame it as a misunderstanding, saying we were just having a heated conversation and that I was overreacting. Marcus did not even look at her when she said it. He looked at me, studied my face for a moment, and then his gaze hardened in a way I had rarely seen. He turned to her and told her bluntly that everyone had noticed how she had been belittling me for months, that it was not subtle, that it was uncomfortable to watch. His voice was steady, not shouting, but firm in a way that carried more weight than any raised tone could have. He brought up the Labor Day barbecue at his cousin's place, an afternoon I remembered as noisy and crowded and unremarkable, and he said that she had told half the guests that I was mediocre, that I lacked drive, that she felt like she had settled. I stood there stunned because I had not known that conversation ever happened, because that day I had been grilling burgers and laughing with people I thought were simply enjoying the holiday. The idea that she'd been walking around planting seeds of doubt about me while I was flipping meat on a grill hit me harder than her confession about another man. Marcus described how awkward it had been, how people had exchanged looks, how he had tried to change the subject because it felt wrong to hear someone speak about their spouse with that level of contempt. Hearing it from him shifted something inside me in a way that was more profound than the calm I had felt earlier. Until that moment I had framed the past few months as escalating tension, as stress spiraling out of control, as something that gradually deteriorated. But Marcus was describing behavior that predated the recent fights, patterns that had been unfolding in rooms I was not even in. This was not a sudden breakdown triggered by unemployment or financial strain. This was consistent, deliberate erosion of my character in front of other people. I replayed the brunch, the engagement party, the supermarket parking lot, and now the barbecue, and the pieces aligned with uncomfortable clarity. It was not random. It was not isolated. It was a pattern of diminishing me publicly and privately, slowly enough that I kept excusing it, rationalizing it, absorbing it as something I needed to endure. Standing there with Marcus, watching her try to reframe everything as a misunderstanding, I realized that what I had been tolerating was not stress or miscommunication, but sustained disrespect that had been visible to others long before I allowed myself to name it. My older sister, Natalie Brooks, arrived about 30 minutes after Marcus left, her car pulling up abruptly at the curb because our neighbor had apparently called my mother when he heard Ray's voices, and my mother in turn had called Natalie assuming she could mediate whatever chaos was unfolding. When I opened the door, Natalie looked at me first, scanning my face the way she used to when we were kids, and I came home with a split lip from a fight, and then she looked at the suitcases still standing on the porch. She did not ask many questions at first. She stepped inside, took an attention in the room, and then quietly asked Lauren to sit down. The authority in Natalie's voice had always been understated but firm, and even Lauren, who had spent months dismissing my feelings, seemed to hesitate under it. Natalie told me she had not wanted to interfere in my marriage, that she believed adults needed to handle their own problems, but that there were things I needed to know. She revealed that at our mother's birthday dinner a few weeks earlier, while I had stepped outside to take a work call about covering an extra shift, Lauren had confided to several relatives that she felt trapped and disappointed in me, that she had implied I lacked vision and drive, that she felt burdened by my supposed mediocrity. I stood there trying to remember that evening, remembering laughing at the table, slicing cake, thinking everything had gone relatively smoothly. I had no idea that while I was outside discussing overtime to pay our bills, she was inside telling my family she felt stuck with me. Natalie's expression was not angry. It was weary, like someone who had watched something deteriorate in slow motion. She said some of the relatives had been uncomfortable and had changed the subject, unsure whether it was a joke or something more serious, but that the tone had not been playful. It had been sharp and deliberate. Hearing that from my own sister, someone who would not exaggerate or dramatize, felt like another layer of truth peeling back. As if that was not enough, there was a knock at the door again, and this time it was Mr. Wallace from next door, a quiet, retired man who usually limited his interactions to polite waves while mowing the lawn. He stood on the porch with his hands folded in front of him and said he did not want to intrude, but that he and his wife had heard yelling almost every evening for weeks. He admitted they had been worried about me, that they had debated whether to check in but did not want to overstep. The way he said it, gently and without accusation, made it clear he was not there to judge but to confirm what had been happening was not invisible. As he spoke, I felt a slow, heavy realization settle in my chest. I had believed the humiliation was contained within the walls of our apartment, that the insults and raised voices dissolved into the air once the argument ended. I had convinced myself that the supermarket scene was an isolated embarrassment, that the brunch comments were misinterpreted, that the engagement party remarks were harmless exaggerations. But now I was hearing from my sister, from my best friend, from a neighbor who barely spoke more than a few sentences a month, that this pattern had been visible to others all along. Multiple people had been quietly worried about me while I was convincing myself that endurance was strength and silence was maturity. The humiliation, I thought, was private had been public, and not in dramatic outbursts, but in consistent, repeated moments that had accumulated over time. Standing there in my own living room, with my sister, my neighbor, and the packed suitcases in view, I understood that what I had normalized as marital conflict had, to everyone else, looked like something far more troubling. Lauren stood in the middle of the living room with her phone in her hand, her composure visibly unraveling now that it was clear she would actually have to leave, and she began calling friends one by one, pacing in tight circles while I stood near the doorway watching reality settle over her. I could hear her voice shift with each call, starting confident and then softening into something closer to pleading as she asked if she could stay for a few nights, explaining vaguely that we had an argument and she needed space. One after another, the responses were short and uncomfortable, excuses about limited room, about prior commitments, about not wanting to get involved. The confidence she had carried earlier that evening was gone, replaced by something strained and brittle. Finally, she stepped into the kitchen and dialed someone else, and when I heard her say the name Dylan Price, I immediately understood this must be the man she had referenced. She put the phone on speaker, without realizing, and from her side of the conversation it became painfully obvious that whatever she had implied earlier had been inflated beyond recognition. She greeted him casually, almost awkwardly, and when she hinted that she needed somewhere to stay because her husband had found out, there was a long silence on the other end before he said, in a confused tone, that he had no idea she was married. He sounded blindsided, like someone who thought they had been chatting casually with a woman at the gym. Nothing more. The conversation was fragmented, but clear enough to piece together that they had spoken casually between sets, maybe exchanged a few light messages. But there was no hidden relationship, no secret romance waiting in the wings. She tried to frame it as something more meaningful. but his responses remained distant and uncertain, and eventually he told her he did not feel comfortable getting involved in marital drama and ended the call. The silence in the apartment after that was heavier than any shouting had been. I looked at her and asked her directly if there had ever actually been an affair. She hesitated, then admitted in a low voice that there had not been, that she had exaggerated, that she wanted to provoke me, that she wanted me to react, to fight for her, to show some dramatic display of passion. She said she had felt invisible and thought shocking me would force me to wake up. I told her calmly that respect is not a game and that marriage is not a stage for emotional experiments. I explained that fabricating infidelity to test someone's reaction was not a cry for love. It was manipulation. The clarity I had felt earlier only solidified. This was not about another man. It was about control, about provoking a response she could measure. I pulled out my phone, opened a rideshare app, and ordered her a car without another argument. She watched me do it, her eyes searching my face for hesitation that never appeared at 9:50 p.m. The car pulled up outside. I carried her 2 suitcases to the curb and set them down beside the open trunk. She stood there under the porch light, arms folded tightly, and said I would regret this, that I was throwing away our marriage over pride. I looked at her and felt none of the doubt she expected. The door closed, the car pulled away, and I stood on the sidewalk until the taillights disappeared. I did not regret it then, and I did not regret it as I walked back into a quiet apartment that finally felt like my own. The weeks that followed did not unravel into chaos the way she had predicted. They unfolded with steady clarity that only reinforced what I had already felt the night she left. At first there was silence, the kind that hums faintly in the background in an apartment that no longer carries tension in its walls, and I realized how accustomed I had become to anticipating conflict every evening. Instead of bracing for criticism, I came home to stillness. Instead of rehearsing explanations in my head during my drive back from work, I simply listened to radio and let my thoughts settle. Her social media narrative began to crumble almost immediately. She posted vague statements about betrayal and being forced out, painting herself as someone who had been discarded unfairly. But the tone shifted dramatically when Dylan Price himself commented publicly under one of her posts, stating plainly that he barely knew her and that they had only spoken casually at the gym. He clarified that he had not been involved in any relationship and had not even known she was married. The comment stayed visible long enough for mutual acquaintances to see it, and the carefully crafted image she was attempting to present fractured in real time. I did not respond. I did not engage. I simply watched as the story she tried to build unraveled on its own. Even her younger brother, who had always been protective of her, reached out to me after learning the full version of events. He admitted that she had framed it differently at first, but that once the exaggeration about the affair came to light, he could not defend what she had done. Hearing that from someone in her own family felt like a quiet validation, not because I needed approval, but because it confirmed that I had not imagined the manipulation. It had been real, and others could now see it. Within a month, I filed for divorce. There were no children to complicate the process, no shared property beyond basic household items, no joint investments tangled together. The lease had always been in my name. The accounts were separate, and the paperwork was straightforward. The simplicity of it all felt almost symbolic, as though the marriage had been hollow long before it formally ended. There was grief in acknowledging that. But it was not the grief of losing something healthy. It was the grief of accepting that what I had been fighting to preserve had already eroded. 3 months later, my home felt entirely different. The air was lighter. The evenings were quiet in a way that soothed rather than suffocated. I reduced my overtime shifts because I no longer needed to carry the full financial burden for 2 people. And for the first time in a long, while I allowed myself to reclaim parts of my life that had been sidelined, I joined Marcus's bowling league on Thursday nights, something I had previously declined because it would have triggered another argument about priorities. I reconnected with family without the undercurrent of tension or whispered concerns. Dinners felt relaxed instead of performative in that calm space. I came to understand something that had eluded me during the marriage. I had confused tolerance with love. I believed that enduring disrespect was proof of commitment, that absorbing criticism without protest was maturity. In reality, I had been slowly shrinking myself in the hope that compliance would create harmony. Letting the marriage end did not feel like a catastrophic loss. It felt like stepping out of a prolonged storm and realizing I had been standing in the rain far longer than necessary. Losing the marriage felt less like failure and more like reclaiming something essential that I had almost given away, and that was my self-respect.